Hey everyone, it's Patch 3.22 Ancestor, and today I want to talk about the build I've been playing for the past week. Today we're going to be talking about Caustic Arrow Magic Find Pathfinder. This is a build I never really considered to be that good of a Magic Finder, but after building it a little bit, after putting it together myself and playing it for a little bit, I must say this is one of the best Magic Finders I've ever played, especially for just how cheap it is and how strong it is. I do want to give some credit to PubGum, as he is the inspiration for me putting this together. People told me that he was playing Caustic Arrow and it was going really well for him. And I thought because I have a guide on Death's Oath Occultist, and because I've played Caustic Arrow myself quite a bit, to give it a go and see how it is. And this has been very, very fun so far. So what I want to do in this guide is I want to handhold you as much as I can if this is your first experience with magic finding. And I want to show you that magic finding is actually really easy to get into and it's really fun to do so. The first thing I want to talk about is going to be the budget for this build. Ideally, you're going to want to have maybe around 100 div, and that is excluding a Headhunter. So realistically, it's about 250 div with a Headhunter, but you do not actually need the Headhunter in this build. You can also put this build together for cheaper, and I would say the absolute minimum budget to get this going is probably going to be around 50 div, but 100 div should make it super comfortable. You can cheap out on a lot of the rolls since we're mostly using unique items, and because of that, you can just find weaker pieces, which means you can probably shave about half of the cost of this whole build. As for the Headhunter, as I mentioned, you don't actually need it. So the Headhunter is mostly optional, but I would highly encourage that you do use a Headhunter, especially if you want to do 8-mod map farming. The reason Headhunter is kind of optional is because we're playing a Chaos Top build, and Chaos Top builds really don't benefit from the Headhunter at all. All the damage buffs Headhunter typically gives are physical as extra, and because we're not doing any physical damage, that doesn't really do anything for us. The reason Headhunter is in this build is simply for the defensive layers it provides us through either stealing the life mod, the temporal bubble, the ES mod, or the endurance charge mods, or any of the other increased tank mods. It also gives us quite a decent amount of extra mobility through both stealing the haste aura and soul eater, making our mapping substantially faster. Overall, in terms of money per hour, Headhunter is just the single best option. But as I mentioned, it's absolutely not needed to get this going, which is a massive leg up on most of the other Magic Find builds. If you've never played Magic Find before, I want to talk a little bit about it just to get everyone on the same page. Magic Find is simply just the act of taking all of the increased quantity and rarity items and stacking them together on one character. Typically, the problem with this has been that all the Magic Find gear just completely sucks and it has no offensive or defensive capabilities on any of the pieces at all, which means that you typically are left with the character that does no damage and is super squishy, which is why Magic Find is typically only played in group play. Now, solo Magic Find is a thing, but the problem with solo Magic Find is it's typically very expensive to get into simply because you have such a weak character that you need to throw a lot of money into the few slots that you do have open to be able to get enough damage to actually clear maps. But typically, even then, you're left with a pretty squishy character that's super hardcore relying on the Headhunter to keep them alive. Well, that's where Caustic Arrow comes in. Caustic Arrow just has the ability to scale to very high DPS, at least for a Magic Finder standard, while basically doing it with no gear, which means that we could take the rest of our open space in our build and just throw on quite a lot of defensive layers to make this build super, super tanky. And that's why, in my opinion, I would say that this build currently is probably a very S tier Magic Finder. I would say this is on the same level as Tornado Shot or the same level as Kinetic Blast, while also being basically a quarter of the price, which I'm just really surprised at how well it works. So why don't we get into the path to building and talk about how to put this character together? The first thing I want to mention is the note section. At the end of the day, this is an Allie guide, and Allie guides have a very, very large note section. If there's anything I didn't cover in the video guide for this, or if there's anything you need a reminder on, I would highly encourage for you to read through the note section, as there's a section on basically everything that you might be interested in, and it should basically serve as a way for you to answer most of your own questions, and it should serve as a way for you to basically answer most of the questions you might have through just the note section. The first thing I want to talk about is how to actually get this build going. Now, if you are league starting or if you're doing this in a future season, I highly, highly recommend don't try to Magic Find on League Start. Magic Finding requires some sort of money to get going. This is not a free build to put together. So ideally, if you want to immediately Magic Find as soon as possible, and you want to play Caustic Arrow Magic Find, what I'd recommend is to potentially just follow my Caustic Arrow Death's Oath Occultist guide, which I'll have in the description below, and I'll have it linked in the path to building as well. And while that is a guide for occultists, it can also just be one-to-one copy pasted over to Pathfinder. The only difference is being just your starting location being slightly different, which is fine because it's actually even better. You get to pick up the good nodes sooner, as a cultist simply just wastes 15 points traveling over to the ranger section of the tree anyway. And your Act 1 start would be a little bit different. Instead of leveling with Rolling Magma, you'd be leveling with Burning Arrow, which should be very easy to do. The other thing to mention is, what if this is your second or third or fourth character and you aren't league starting? Well, what I would recommend in that case is to follow Tai Killer's Leveling Twink Guide. This is a guide that goes over how to very quickly level any character with Hollow Palm. And this will be in the note section and linked below. And this is what I would highly recommend for you to just do to get yourself a character really quickly. Even if you're not good at leveling, you should be able to level any character in about 3 to 4 hours following this guide. And it's very cheap to do, especially if you're doing it in the middle of the season. As Tai recommends, as I'm going to recommend, you really should get a carry once you're done with Act 10, because this build really does not work immediately. You are going to at minimum need around level 85. And I would highly recommend at least 90. And I would say you should probably get to 95 before getting this build going. But 85 to 90 is going to be the absolute bare minimum to make it feel good. So because of that, I would recommend as soon as you get your Act 10 done, just immediately go buy yourself some 5 carries. You shouldn't really need that many to get to 90, and you should be able to get the build going. With that said, this build is going to be decently tanky, so you can actually self-level it with a decent amount of results. You should maybe expect yourself to get to about level 97 to 98. It depends on how safe you play. You could potentially even hit 99 and 100 if you use omens and if you play super safe, especially around the strong boxes. But with how tanky it is, anyone should be able to get 97, 98 relatively easy. Moving on, let's talk about our skill tree or ascendancy, and let's get all that out of the way. We're going to be playing this as a Pathfinder. The reason we're playing Pathfinder is, one, we have access to Master Surgeon, which is going to make keeping up Divination Distillate substantially easier. This is a life flask that gives us Magic Find stats, but the problem with this is as soon as we hit max life, it's going to immediately turn off. Typically, people have dealt with this by just simply going Petrified Blood, but the nice thing about Pathfinder is we don't need to do that, as Master Surgeon makes it always active, meaning we never have to worry about it. And to top that up, we also have Nature's Adrenaline, which is going to allow us to use Progenesis as an amazing defensive layer. And this is going to be the bread and butter of how this build doesn't die. Lastly, we also get Nature's Reprisal, which is just a really nice DPS increase, and it's a way for us to inflict some Wither stacks, and it's just the next best node. The reason we're playing Pathfinder over Deadeye or Ranger is just because the other two classes don't really give us anything. We don't need any sort of chaining or additional arrows or attack speed or anything that Deadeye might provide for us. And Frenzy Charge scaling, albeit while still very strong, just isn't really as good as Pathfinder, especially when we just take Nature's Adrenaline into consideration for how strong it's going to make Progenesis. In terms of Pantheons, what I'd recommend is to just run Lunaris and Gurkdal, as these are the only two Pantheons that are really going to do anything for us in high-end maps, simply because the only thing this build is struggling on is having enough physical damage reduction, and Lunaris and Gurkdal will just give us quite a lot of that. As for Bandits, just kill both Bandits, as all we need is passive points. Moving on to the skill tree itself. So the skill tree is a pretty typical Chaos Dot skill tree. We're simply going to be pathing through the north side of the Ranger section, picking up some life nodes, picking up some Chaos Dot nodes, getting ourselves 2 clusters, and getting ourselves any other good nodes in between. This build is going to heavily be abusing tattoos, and the reason we can get away with that is because we have Supreme Ostentation. What this does is it makes it so we don't care about any attribute requirements, meaning we're free to tattoo all of our skill tree away. And as you can see, we have 44, 62, and 24 attributes. This makes it so we, one, don't need attributes on any of our gear, which is great because we're running all uniques and we can't really get any attributes in the first place. And 2, this season, it's even better because we get to just abuse all of the new tattoos. In terms of tattoos, there's only one real tattoo that we want to run everywhere and a second tattoo on a lower budget. The main tattoo we're going to be using this build is going to be the Honor Tattoo of the Pillager. This gives us 3% rarity per tattoo, and it's going to be what we ideally want on every single skill point on our tree. We can't really do that because we need to get Spell Suppression Cap, and before higher budget levels where we can get Quartz Infusion, which currently is extremely expensive, we need to also fit in some Spell Suppression tattoos to give us 100% Spell Suppression when we combine it with Quickstep and when we combine it with Invigorate. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be using a Warrior's Tail, which is going to make everything within the circle twice as strong. So our 2% Spell Suppression tattoos become 4% Spell Suppression tattoos. And when we put these in every single point that we can within the radius, as well as adding 3 additional ones outside the radius, we hit 100% Spell Suppression. Once you get yourself a Flesh and Flame for Quartz Infusion, you would ideally be dropping all these spell suppression tattoos in favor of even more rarity tattoos. Lastly, we're going to be adding in 1 Hinakura Shaman tattoo for 3 mana per second. This is turned to 6 mana per second when near Warrior's Tale. Personally, I found that under high attack speed, your mana feels a little bit bad and it feels a little bit janky. So having 6 mana per second completely takes care of any issues you might have. The other tattoo we're going to be using is going to be 1 Honor Tattoo of the Hunter for +1 all deck skill gems. This is going to give us quite a lot of added damage, as additional skill gems is going to be the way we're going to be scaling Caustic Arrow to a very, very high amount. Moving on next, I want to talk about the cluster jewels really quickly. These are going to be very, very simple. We're going to have 1 medium flask cluster jewel. This is going to be with Spike Concoction and Brewed for Potency. There's going to be quite a lot of other options you can run instead of Brewed for Potency, but this is the one I prefer the most. These are very cheap. And Spike Concoction is just way too overpowered to not use, as Alchemist Genius is incredibly strong. And then for our other medium jewels, we're just going to simply be running 3 Chaos Dot clusters. For these clusters, there's quite a few options on where you could run for these notables, and I have quite a few options at the bottom of the note section for different possibilities. But personally, I really like running Flow of Life and Brewed for Potency, but there's other options for either more regen or more tankiness or more damage. Lastly, we have the large cluster jewels, and these are going to be all over the place. The most important thing here is going to be Unspeakable Gifts. This is going to give us the majority of our clear on top of Caustic Arrow, and ideally we want to have 2 Unspeakable Gifts, as 20% chance to explode feels really, really strong. For the other 2 nodes, you have 3 options. You can go Touch of Cruelty, you can go Unwaveringly Evil, and you can go Wicked Paul. Now, currently, if you go for Unwaveringly Evil and Wicked Paul, those clusters are about 20 div each. They are extremely expensive because crafting Unspeakable Gifts clusters are extremely difficult to do. So instead, we are going to be trying to replace either Unwaveringly Evil or Wicked Paul with Touch of Cruelty. I would search for any of the 3 together plus Unspeakable Gifts and just buy whatever is cheapest, as all 3 nodes are just as strong as each other. But these are going to be the most expensive part of the whole skill tree. Lastly, while we're on the skill tree, I want to talk about the Timeless Jewel, just to get everyone on the same board on how it works and how you can go about searching for one of these for your build. So the most important thing here is that the name is going to be Casprio. We need it to be Casprio to turn Ghost Dance into Supreme Ostentation, which, as I mentioned, is extremely important for us being able to fit all of our tattoos and make this build work. The other thing that we're interested in are going to be any nodes that get turned into 40% increased rarity. Ideally, we want one of the nodes to be on Mind Drinker because we want to pick up the Mana Reservation Mastery anyways. You can find better Elegant Hubris with even more of these. You could potentially find 2 rarity and 3 rarity nodes, but just to start this build off, 1 rarity node on Mind Drinker is more than enough. These are really easy to search for as well. All you have to do is just go to the bottom and click Find Timeless Jewel and Path of Building. And all you have to do is just very quickly set this up. You're going to select Elegant Hubris. You're going to select Casprio as your Conqueror. You're going to select Ghost Dance as a jewel socket. You're going to click Filter Nodes, so it only looks at nodes you have allocated. You're going to go to Search for Node, and you're going to type Rarity, and you're going to add Discerning Taste into your desired nodes. And you're just simply going to hit Search. This is then going to compile a list of every single possible Elegant Hubris with Casprio that turns Mind Drinker into 40% rarity. You're then just going to hit Copy Trade URL. You're going to go over to the trade website, and you're just simply going to paste this in. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a search for you with a bunch of filters on every single possible Timeless Jewel from this list that has exactly that outcome. And then all you do is just simply buy the cheapest, slot it in, and then it'll have rarity on Mind Drinker, and it'll turn your Ghost Dance into Supreme Ostentation. If you want to find a better one, all you do is just allocate a bunch of nodes that you're okay with getting for rarity. So for example, we would just pick a bunch of nodes like this that are 2 passive points away from where we are. Ideally, you wouldn't want to pick up something like this that's 3 passive points away unless we can actually get a rarity node on it. Then we hit Find Timeless Jewel, search again. As you can see, these are going to be the ones that have 3 rarity nodes on them. These are going to be the 2. You just simply hit Copy Trade URL again, slap them into here, and then you go and look for those as well. Up next, I want to talk about all the gear and how to either craft it or how to look out for cheaper items and what roles are really important. So the first thing I want to talk about is going to be the bow and quiver for this build. Typically in most bow builds, you want to be spending a large sum of money on your bow. You want a really, really strong bow, and that's going to be where most of your DPS is going to come from. Well, in this build, it's actually quite the opposite. We're simply going to be running a Widow Hail, and what Widow Hail does is it makes whatever quiver we have equipped substantially stronger. At a max roll, this effectively makes your quiver 3.5 times stronger, which means you have 3.5 quivers equipped. Because of that, that means whatever quiver we want to equip is going to need to be super strong because we're effectively getting 3.5 of them. Which means instead of spending most of our money on our bow, we're going to be spending a lot of money on a quiver. The quiver for this build is going to be a double damage over time multiplier quiver. These are kind of a pain in the ass to craft, and I would honestly just recommend just to buy one. Just any quiver with damage over time multiplier and chaos damage over time multiplier works. Ideally get one with life because the life is tripled, and ideally get one with a chaos resistance roll. Even just crafting a hybrid roll like this is more than enough because this is going to effectively almost chaos res cap you. This quiver is currently worth 52% chaos resistance on its own. If you do want to craft one of your own, or if you want to try, I do have a crafting guide in the notes section. It is kind of a pain in the ass to do, and it's a lot of RNG, and you can potentially sell some of the bricks for profits. But it really isn't that fun to do. And honestly, I would just save the time and effort and just buy a half decent quiver instead. Up next, we have the helmet. Now, this is going to be something that you do want to craft. This is simply a double rarity helmet with double mana reservation on it and some life. The way this is crafted is by simply getting yourself a fractured rarity prefix helmet and using loathing essence until you roll tier 1 rarity suffix. There is both a rarity prefix and a rarity suffix, and we want both of them. The reason we're fracturing the prefix is because it's going to make it substantially cheaper to hit a high life roll at the end of the craft. The way this is going to be made is once we have our tier 1 rarity suffix with our loathing essences, we want to annul a suffix if it's full suffixes. Then we're going to make the Searing Exarch dominant on the helmet, use Eldritch Annuls to annul all of our prefixes off, and then just simply Eldritch Exalt, Eldritch Exalt, Eldritch Annul until we hit tier 3 or higher life. Then we're going to finish the craft by just simply using some greater embers and greater ichors to craft mana cost of attacks and mana reservation efficiency. You'd also give this to a lab runner if you really want to get either Caustic Arrow AoE or Caustic Arrow damage on it, but these really are not necessary and they're kind of just cherry on the tops, which you can completely skip. If you want a full guide on how to make this item, there is going to be a guide in the notes section below, and I would really recommend reading through it and following it, as it's going to make it really easy and it will hold your hand through the whole thing. Next up, we have one of the big items for this build, and it's going to be Greed's Embrace. This is a chestplate that has a lot of quantity and a lot of rarity on it. And the important thing here is this is where we're going to be putting our Caustic Arrow. And because of that, we want to find a corrupted one with either +2 AoE, +2 projectile, +2 duration, or +1 socketed gems. This is going to be very important, and I would recommend to look for a implicit one rather than a max quant and max rarity one. That implicit modifier is going to be substantially more important as it's going to be a large portion of your DPS. As you can see here, +2 AoE gems is 21% of the total DPS in this build. It's okay to cheap out on getting lower quantity and lower rarity if it does mean you can afford one of these. Again, you don't need a 6-linked one, as you can self-6-link it really easily through Tainted Fusings, which I'll have a video in the description below, and it's also mentioned in the notes section as well on how to do that. Ideally, you would find yourself +4 or +3 or +1 socketed because we're running an Empower, which is the same thing as +4, but those are going to be very expensive, and they're mostly going to be an endgame upgrade. Up next, for gloves, there's only one pair of gloves that we want to run, that is Sedima's. These are the only gloves with quant on them in the game, and we're going to want to get ourselves a Despair on Hit version. Now, the thing about these is they're very expensive, so if you can't afford a 10% quant version of them with Despair on Hit, do look for a pair with lower quant, but you really need that Despair on Hit. It's going to make it so you kill bosses substantially faster, and it's going to be a large portion of your single target damage. For boots, we're running Goldworm. These are the only quant boots in the game, and they're the only things worth considering. They're really cheap because they're super common, so getting a max rolled pair of them is really easy. What you can do is you can even look for a corrupted pair with either max life or increased movement speed as the implicits. We do not need +2 AoE gems or +2 aura gems because there's no aura that's going to be worth putting into this. Our auras are going to end up in our Widow Hail with an Inlay, and we're going to have a 6-link aura bot bow. And the only other aura we're running is a haste, and +2 gems is not enough to actually give you a haste breakpoint. So you don't care about those in your Goldworm. So you're just simply going to be looking for either life or movement speed as a corruption implicit if you really want one. Lastly, you can give these to a lab runner, and I believe it costs about a div for most boot enchants. And you're going to look for reduced mana cost of skills. Now, you don't need the boot enchant, but I would recommend to get it because it's going to make the build feel substantially comfier, especially if you get a lot of attack speed from your Headhunter. Moving on to amulets, we actually have quite a lot of options for amulets. We can either go Defiance of Destiny, which is the new amulet added this season, Eyes of the Grey Wolf, or a crafted dot multi amulet. Now, Defiance of Destiny is going to be the best option if you want to be a Giga Tank. This is a new amulet added this season, which I'll have a video linked in the description below if you want to know more about it. But effectively, this, when combined with the rest of our defensive layers, makes us pretty much immortal. Eyes of the Grey Wolf is going to be the option that you want if you want more quantity into your build. This is the only way to get a large amount of quantity, and you can roll up to 20% on these. But bear in mind, a 20% quant Grey Wolf is going to be very expensive. The only other implicit worth considering on here is going to be chaos damage, as it's the only other implicit that actually gives us any sort of damage out of the whole pool. But if you're going to buy yourself an Eyes of the Grey Wolf, make sure it's a quant one, as a just chaos damage Eyes of the Grey Wolf is not going to be worth bothering with, especially when we have a crafted dot multi amulet instead, as this would give you substantially more damage than a Grey Wolf. So if you don't want defenses and you don't want extra quant and you just want as much raw damage as possible, go for a crafted amulet instead. There'll be a guide on how to make this amulet in the notes section as well, if you are interested in making one, but this is simply just an Impending Doom chaos amulet, which is very, very simple to make. Moving on, we have our rings. Now, these are going to be wildly expensive or basically free. We have Vender's Gambles. These are rings that have a massive, massive pool of rolls that it can roll, meaning a very, very high rolled Vender's Gamble is going to cost mirrors. Because of that, you're going to have to prioritize which rolls are important to you and which rolls to forget about. Ideally, you want max quantity and max rarity, but you also have to take the resistances into consideration, as these resistances is going to be where we res cap. Ideally, you want to be over res capped by quite a large margin, because we want to click basically every single altar that we get when we do maps, especially if that altar says increase quantity and increase rarity, as it's just a multiplier on top of our existing quantity and rarity. And if any of those altars that end up having quant on them also end up having the reduced cold and lightning resistance rolls from Eater, well, we're going to need to be overcapped for them so we don't go below res cap, which means we're substantially squishier. And because of that, we're going to want to heavily focus on getting high resistance rolls on these. No matter what you get, make sure to also resistance catalyst them, because that'll just make them substantially stronger. And it could potentially mean that a cheaper Vender's Gamble could potentially be an upgrade. Lastly, we have the belt. So as I mentioned at the start of this, Headhunter is optional. You don't actually need a Headhunter in this build. Ideally, you want a Headhunter because it's going to be the best belt, because it's going to increase your money per hour the most out of any other item in the slot. But if you can't afford one, or if you don't want to run a belt, what you would ideally be running is a Hunter Life Belt instead. These are very easy to craft, and I'll have a crafting guide in the notes section as well. But the TLDR here is you're using Life Flask Recovery Greed Essences to roll for tier 1 life. Then you are annulling the prefix if you need to have an open prefix. Crafting prefixes cannot be changed on a open suffix, and veiling for chaos resistance. Then simply just using a Hunter Exalted Orb on the prefixes if you do end up getting chaos resistance, and then finishing the craft with Flask Effect Duration. This will serve you well, and this will be all you need until you get yourself a Headhunter, and getting a decent one of these shouldn't really cost too much. Moving on to the flasks. Now, the flasks are going to be pretty important to increase your money per hour, as well as keeping you alive. Because we are running Master Surgeon, we want to get ourselves a really, really well-rolled Eternal Life Flask. We're specifically going for Eternal Life Flask because we're going to get so many charges that this is going to be the best option, because it's going to give us the most amount of recovery. Ideally, we want to get ourselves a increased amount recovered, reduced recovery rate flask, just to have it active for as long as possible. This is also where we're going to be getting our bleeding and corrupted blood immunity from. It should be very easy to spam this as much as possible, especially since we have quite a lot of increased flash charges gained. And we're going to be combining that with a divination distillate, simply because this gives us quantity and rarity as well. Now, if you are res capping, make sure you are res capped and over res capped without divination distillate active, as you do not want to rely on this, especially since you might run into a little bit of an area where there's not enough monsters to get your flash charges back, and you might be in a little bit of an awkward situation. But this flask is going to be amazing in this build, because typically the one downside of it being that it turns off when you hit max life is completely nullified by Master Surgeon, making it so your life flasks never turn off until their duration is actually over. For our other 3 flasks, we're simply going to be adding in a Quicksilver Flask for movement speed, a Gold Flask for increased rarity, and then between these 2 flasks, you're going to want increased rarity of items found during effect and reduced mana cost of skills during effect. Ideally, put the reduced mana cost of skills on your Quicksilver because it lasts longer, and it would feel a little bit awkward for this to go off as often as putting it on your gold flask. And then just put the rarity on your gold flask just because it's the only other place to put it. The last flask that we want to add into this build is going to be Progenesis. Now, this flask is insane, especially in Pathfinder, because Pathfinder gets so many flash charges for free that we can very easily have 100% uptime on this, which is going to be about half of our total defenses by itself. Progenesis makes it so 25% of all damage we take is instead taken over 4 seconds. And this also benefits from Flask effect, which means that this 25% realistically is closer to 40%. And you can realistically, with enough Flask effect duration, actually get it to 100%, meaning all damage you take is instead taken over 4 seconds, meaning you can never be one shot. Progenesis is extremely strong, and I would recommend to get yourself one. But if you don't want to run a Progenesis, you can instead either run a Jade Flask for more evasion or get yourself an Armor Flask for some armor. Last thing to mention is going to be the rest of our jewels. We are going to be running Bloodnotch in this build. When combining Bloodnotch with Defiance of Destiny and Progenesis, we are going to effectively be immortal. This setup of 3 things took this build from being kind of squishy to basically never being able to fall over. If you don't know what Bloodnotch does, is it takes whatever percent of Bloodnotch you have. So if you have a max roll Bloodnotch, it'd be 60% of all damage from stunning hits and recovers it the next server tick after any damage instance. Meaning, assuming you can get stunned every single hit, this means that 60% of all damage you take, assuming it didn't one-shot you, is immediately recovered, which gives you 60% damage reduction. The way we can make everything stun us is by having a very low energy shield. As you can see, we have 34 energy shield in this build. Then simply pick up Ridden in Blood and pick up the energy shield mastery, which makes it so our stun threshold is based on our energy shield instead of life. With us having effectively 15 total life when enemies attack us when they roll for if they stun us or not, this means literally every hit against us will be a stun, which means that we just ignore 60% of all those hits. We can then combine this with a Immutable Force, which gives us quite a lot of increased stun and block recovery, which means we don't actually ever notice those stuns. Because Caustic Arrow has the Chaos tag on it, that means we could also abuse Unwaveringly Evil to make it so Chaos skills ignore interruption from stuns, meaning even though we are going to get mini stunned, Unwaveringly Evil makes it so our Caustic Arrow will never get canceled by one of those mini stuns. Lastly, we're also going to be adding in a Watcher's Eye. Now, the Watcher's Eye, you have quite a lot of possibility on what you want to run here. Ideally, in a perfect world, you'd be getting yourself a Onslaught on Kill while affected by Haste and Dot Multiplier while affected by Malevolence, Watcher's Eye, but those are extremely expensive, and those are mostly going to be a endgame upgrade. Before that, what I'd recommend to do is to get yourself an Onslaught on Kill Haste Watcher's Eye. You don't need any other roll on here, just this. It's going to be so much extra movement speed that's going to be hard to live without it. Another option before you get yourself a Flesh and Flame or Quartz Infusion is to instead get yourself phasing while affected by haste. This is going to make it so you don't have any sort of weird issues with not being able to run through enemies, but that doesn't mean you'll lose out on the Onslaught. You could look for Onslaught and phasing, but those are also pretty expensive. And ideally, in a min-maxed version of this build, you'd be running Onslaught on Kill while affected by haste and Damage over time multiplier while affected by Malevolence. In terms of playstyle, this build is going to be extremely comfortable to actually play. All you have to do is just spam Caustic Arrow all over the place. I'm mostly going to be talking about this build from a Ape mod map perspective, as that's typically going to be the most worthwhile thing to do with a Magifying character. All you're really going to be doing is just spamming Caustic Arrow, and because you're running Arrow Nova, the Arrow Nova is going to basically hit the whole screen around you. And then whenever you get to a strongbox, all you have to do is just tap a Vol Caustic Arrow on top of it, and the Vol Caustic Arrow is going to do double the damage of your normal Caustic Arrow and instantaneously kill all the monsters that spawn from the strongboxes. If you ever encounter something that doesn't immediately die, or if you get to the map boss, just simply drop 1 or 2 Vol Caustics on them. Now, mind you, the zones do not stack with each other, so only one damage over time zone will do damage at any point, but you can spread them out to have better coverage if the boss decides to move around, meaning it'll always be in one of the Vol Caustics to take damage. But between Vol Caustic and between normal Caustic Arrow, you should basically be able to insta-clear the whole screen. This does feel really comfy if you do have the Caustic AoE helmet enchant because it just makes your Caustics that much bigger. Otherwise, you're simply just going to be using Withering Step on left click to move around a little bit faster. And you're going to want to make sure you Withering Step any enemy that you actually need to kill that isn't immediately dying, as those Wither stacks from Anomalous Withering Step is going to make them die substantially faster. The only other thing you really have to do is just simply press your haste, which is on a Divine Blessing every 10 seconds, just to zoom around a little bit faster. You can choose to replace the haste with a determination or with any other aura of your choosing. And you don't even have to run it in general if you don't want to press a divine blessing at all. It just means you'll be losing out on haste in general. But if you're okay with dropping movement speed for the sake of not having to press an extra button, completely fine to do as well. This build has been the most fun Magic Finder I've ever played. I have quite a lot of experience with Magic Finding, but I've never actually done it solo. This is my first time doing solo Magic Find, and I'm so happy that I decided to choose Caustic Arrow as my build for it. If you have any questions on how to put this together, or if you have any questions on Magic Finding, feel free to leave a comment in the description below, and I'll be more than happy to answer you as soon as I can. I also stream on Twitch every single day, so feel free to come by there and ask me a question directly. And over the next few days, I do want to make a guide on how to actually use your shiny new Magic Find character and to do some apothecary farming. So the next video after this is going to be a video on specifically that with Magic Find apothecary farming, which I'm very much looking forward to. Other than that, I hope you cuties have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you cuties in the next video. Enjoy the build.